Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Goku. Today, we're going to continue reading of a paper. This paper is about the provisional strategies for decolonizing consciousness. Before I get into the paper, I just want to remind you that this podcast is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. Also on this network, a few other shows that you might not be familiar with. So just take a listen to these quick spots.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
All right, make sure to check out the other shows on the KWAZ Radio Network. Also, if you guys, I've been getting hit up a lot about this on Instagram and stuff. If you own like a Black brand, right, and you want to get it out there to the conscious community, by all means, you can advertise on the show if you want to do so, and it's just low rates at the time. So now is a good time to jump in and do it if that's what you want to do. Hit me up on all forms of social media or use the contact information at the top of the screen. You could text me or you can send an email and we could work out how to proceed. Okay. So we're talking about provisional strategies for decolonizing consciousness. And I wanted to do this paper because it's not as centered on the continent, the African continent, as others I've been reading in the recent weeks. But I think it's still a good insight into, how do we go about in trying to wake up our people. So this paper is written by Phia S and Glenn Adams, and it starts off like this. In 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was on his way back from a convenience store when he caught the attention of self-appointed neighborhood watch leader, quote-unquote leader, George Zimmerman. Zimmerman thought the young man looked, quote, real suspicious. So he called the police and decided to pursue Martin despite police dispatch explicitly instructing him not to do so. According to Zimmerman, he got out of his car, confronted Martin, and a physical altercation ensued. Martin had a bag of Skittles and a can of iced tea. Zimmerman had a 9mm handgun, which he used to shoot and kill Martin. The case caused national controversy as authorities did not arrest Zimmerman for 44 days under Florida's Stand Your Ground law, and the jury subsequently acquitted him of any wrongdoing. It's crazy to read it, and it was crazy to live through this phenomenon. Perceptions of the case differed sharply as a function of race. What's all this notification about? Sharply as a function of race. According to national polls, 53% of white Americans believe that racial bias was a minor factor or not a factor at all in the events leading up to Martin's death. And 52% believe that race made no difference in the authorities' decision not to arrest Zimmerman at the time of the shooting. In contrast, 72% of Black Americans indicated racial bias as a major factor in the events leading up to Martin's death, and 73% thought that authorities would have arrested Zimmerman if Martin had been white versus Black. And so here's the thing, I wouldn't expect this paper to write it in the real terms of what's going on, but the real deal of what's going on is you are in a war. And these folks are killing you with impunity. Right? You are in a war. And once you understand that, then you'll understand why Zimmerman wasn't, arrested sooner. You'll understand why these white folks who they're polling, right? 'Cause I'm sure it's mostly white folks they're polling here, right? You'll understand why they, are claiming, racism. What racism? Right? Because a part of war is to fool people. Right? That's a major part of war. It's to fool you. I remember as a kid, back in my home country, we were studying a war, like a Buccaneer War, and this British general was about to lose, essentially, right? But what he did was he didn't have enough manpower. So what he did was he lined up his soldiers and made them walk down this path. When they got down to the bottom of the path, there was a route that they could take to circle back around. So he took maybe 100 soldiers. I can't remember the numbers now. He took maybe 100 or a few hundred soldiers, and using this deception, that's what I want to find. Using this deception of sending these soldiers down this path, when they got down to the bottom of the path, they quickly scurried back around and then marched again, right? So that whoever was, the Buccaneers or whoever was observing them would think, wow, these guys have thousands of soldiers on this island. That's what war is. It's deception. Right? It's hiding the true, or hiding the reality of what's going on. So these white folks are never going to admit that there's racial biases, right? Shout out to Untitled from the pro-black perspective in the chat room. He says all warfare is based on deception. Sun Tzu. Right? These guys are never going to acknowledge that there's anything racial. These guys will burn a cross on your lawn and pretend like it ain't burning. So if you don't understand the predicament that you're in, you won't understand anything. I know I sound like Neely Fuller right now, but if you don't understand what you're in, a war, then everything else will baffle you. So, I think at this point, if I'm honest, I think most of us understand that we're in a war. Most of us understand that these white folks are dealing in deception in how they deal with us. But I think some things are changing a little bit. I think more people are catching on, but you have to understand where you're at, right? And what's happening around you. And if you understand that, then you'll understand how to organize yourself to put up a fight against it, right? To continue, different reactions to the killing of Trayvon Martin are one example of a broader topic that is the subject of our research in this chapter. Specifically, racial group differences in perceptions of racism and racial bias. White Americans tend to see much less racism in contemporary U.S. society more generally. You see, again, I don't expect these authors, and I'm not even sure if they're black or they're white or in between, but I don't expect them to spell out what's really going on. This is why you guys have to listen to, and not necessarily you guys, because in some cases I think I'm preaching to the choir, right? But you guys have to start to, or the people around us, more specifically, who are not listening right now, need to kind of understand and change your mindset. That's why when like Onita says, you know, you're a population and a nation, that's an important thing to understand. Like, the guns are pointed at you. What you gonna do about it? Because white folks ain't gonna own up to, even the greatest abolitionist type white folks, they ain't gonna own up to what's going on, because truth of the matter is they like their place in society. So just to repeat this, white Americans tend to see much less racism in contemporary U.S. society more generally, especially in events involving police or other government actors, than do people from many racial minority groups. You know, so someone could read that and could say, well, you know, that's just black folks or non-white folks playing the victim. Right, and I think, you know, this was kind of the point I was trying to make earlier. I think what's happening now is we understand that there's deception. I think that what's happening more so now is we're mind blown. Our minds are being blown by how vulgar, how in your face this deception is being played out. Right? How incredulous you could see these folks are in pretending that, you know, they're not doing anything, you know, to our people. And I'm not here trying to push a victim narrative, but I am here to point out that these people are doing, you know, what we say they're doing. And, you know, I've always held this thought in my mind once I started thinking about nations and stuff like that. Like, you know, we can say that these folks are building their nation or guarding their nation and stuff like that. But you could do that without these conflicts that occur over and over again with our people in the street. Right? I mean, you could say that, well, it's an intimidation tactic to keep you thinking little of yourself, to never rise up. But, you know, you could do this in a different way. They choose not to. And so we can't lament that they choose not to do this a different way. We just got to counter what they do, right? To continue. The different reactions also illustrate the incorporation of anti-racism movements that is the topic of this volume as a whole. Many Black Americans perceive Martin's murder and Zimmerman's acquittal as another example of how American society and the modern global order degrade, dehumanize, and devalue Black lives, right? Many Black Americans, many Black folks in general perceive this. Right? But the question is, to counter whatever they're talking about here, the question is, what are we going to do about it? This perception inspired the initial use of the hashtag Black Lives Matter, which has since become a rallying call for broader efforts at racial justice. In response, hegemonic institutions have reacted to such anti-racism efforts by co-opting them, transforming calls for social justice into calls for equal treatment, for example, All Lives Matter, that neutralize the revolutionary potential of anti-racism efforts and erase the historical and cultural context in which racial violence, exploitation, and discrimination persists. I mean, how much revolutionary potential did Black Lives Matter really have? right? I mean, if you break down Black Lives Matter, it's, you know, it's like a heavily leaning LGBTQ, RSTUV type organization, recently on their website, up until a couple of weeks ago, they had a lot of anti-family, anti-black male type stuff going on. How revolutionary was it? Was it ever? Black Lives Matter wasn't even worthy to sit at the feet of, say, the Black Panthers, right? So how revolutionary really was it? But to the point of All Lives Matter being a counter, I mean, that's a part of that deception. Folks knew what Black Lives Matter meant. I remember people spending days explaining, just because we are for Black lives don't mean we against all lives. If I'm talking about a certain type of cancer, you can't say all. I mean, shut up. These folks know exactly what you're talking about. They know exactly what you mean. Same thing with the defund the police thing. And ho-ass Obama was out here talking about, who talks down to black folks generally, right? We know what defund the police means. Just like we knew what Kaepernick was kneeling for, all of that shit. But the name of the game is to play dumb and to deceive, right? What did King Leopold do in the Congo? He made it seem like he was doing all this benevolent work, right? Sending out aid and all this stuff and setting up programs and all this stuff. Meanwhile, he was chopping off black folks' hands, killing them, using them, exploiting them, right? Again, if you don't understand the situation you're in and the combatants in particular that you're working against, you won't understand. You'll always be confused. In the chat room, Renee, hey Renee, what's up? Says deception is the most difficult part of war for us to comprehend. This is why black people spend so much time trying to explain racist actions to white people. Beautifully said. Well said. Right? Well said. Racial terrorism is a hobby for white folks. I agree. Right? Because it's something a little bit more than just nation building or nation guarding. There's something more to it. Right? So that brings us to this section called the colonization of perception and consciousness. At the heart of Anti-Racism Incorporated is a struggle over the definition and perception of reality. Is the U.S. a place of liberty and justice for all, as the Pledge of Allegiance claims, or is it a white supremacist state founded and maintained by racial violence? Talk about rhetorical question of the year, right? According to a poll with millennials aged 14 to 24, 91% of these teens and young adults believe in equality and believe everyone should be treated equally. Yet a majority of them also believe it's never fair to give preferential treatment to one race over another, regardless of historical inequalities. 65% of people of color, 74% for white, right? That's the breakdown who also believes and who also responded to this question, right? These young people operated in a neoliberal individualist mode of the modern global order, aspire to be enlightened citizens of the world, free from chauvinistic prejudice, who live with mutual respect and in peaceful harmony with their fellow human beings. They rail against blatant expressions of racism with genuine outrage, and they will occasionally take forceful measures to resist them. Yet, this is an inherently ambiguous move. How does one call for the elimination of racism from a position within the global order or mainstream U.S. institutions while failing to acknowledge the racist historical foundations of those systems? Again, again, is deception. Now, it is true, but and the reason it's deception is this thing that they call racism, the thing that we tend to call racism, this outright hate and all this kind of stuff. Let's be clear about it. That stuff is passed down generation to generation. And the interesting thing is, I don't think that it's passed down, for the most part, as protecting this white nation per se. I think it's just passed down as we don't like them, end of story. Right? Now, ultimately, we know this is a part of, it's all a part of the propaganda to maintain whiteness and this this idea of a white, powerful nation, etc. But for the average white person, I don't think they're that intellectual about what they're doing. On one hand, hegemonic narratives that inform mainstream constructions of American identity, rooted in an epistemic perspective of white Americans, propose that the U.S. is essentially good. A shining beacon. Let me highlight this bullshit here. The U.S. is essentially good, a shining beacon of human progress and a place of freedom and equality. These narratives do not necessarily dispute difficult to deny facts about racial violence. Examples: slavery, legal segregation, lynching. That might seem to contradict celebratory claims about the essential good character of U.S. society. Now, you see, I've always had a problem with this. You'll see this from, elected officials, right? That the U.S. is good. I forgot who said it recently. It could have been Biden, actually. Right? The U.S. is good. Do we have problems? Sure, but that's the thing. The thing is, if a man or a woman gets locked up for pedophilia, would you still stand up there and talk about they're good? A man kills a couple of people. Will you, like Dylan Roof went in a church and would you say, well, I know what he did is wrong, but he's a good kid? Or no. But again, this is where our people are failing. Our people are listening to this nonsense and internalizing it and taking it in. Right? I'm sorry. Internalizing it, taking it in, and believing what's being said. Often in life, two things can be true, but in this instance here, these two things are not true. Instead, they incorporate this knowledge into celebratory accounts of U.S. identity in a way that does not disrupt the status quo and require drastic revolutionary action to remedy. According to these narratives, the problem of racism is a relatively circumscribed matter at odds with the defining features of contemporary U.S. society, something that the virtuous majority of present-day citizens routinely repudiate in the rare instances when it occurs. And so that's the other part of the bullshit that these folks do. I remember working in a lab some years ago, and a white girl telling me, well, things will get better because all the races are now dying off. Are you crazy? I told her, are you mad? Are you insane? Their children are the next set of races. Their grandchildren are the next. What are you talking about? And she knew better. Deep down inside me, I think she knew better, right? But it's that game of trying to deceive, and because there's a history of black folks falling for the okie doke, right? They keep pushing these narratives on us. What's the saying? It's difficult to be conscious. To be conscious in America is to be angry every day, or something along those lines. Like, that's how it feels. You have to be angry every day because people are pushing some bullshit narrative on you that is not true. And we have to watch and witness our people go along with it, knowing that it's just foolishness. On the other hand, more critical constructions of American identity, often rooted in everyday experience and epistemic perspectives of marginalized racial and ethnic minority communities, provide a very different understanding of U.S. society. These constructions note how the U.S. is a colonial imposition, created when Europeans, informed by notions of racial superiority, stole land and resources from indigenous societies, imported enslaved Africans. I like that they use the word enslaved Africans, right? To work and develop the stolen property, and then declare their independence when European rulers began to restrain these racial depredations. I see a footnote here that I passed. Oh yeah, so early on in the paper when I read this part that says, instead, they incorporate this knowledge into celebratory accounts of U.S. identity in a way that does not disrupt the status quo and require drastic revolutionary action to remedy. There's a footnote here that reads, take for instance a textbook discussion of the transatlantic slave trade, where the authors refer to enslaved Africans as workers. In cases such as this, even hard to deny facts about racial violence are reinterpreted and reimagined to render them less damaging. Laura Isensi, quote, why calling slaves workers is more than an editing error for NPR in October 2015. So that was something said by her in October 2015. So anyway, I thought I'll just add that in there. And now I gotta find where I was. Yeah, so Europeans began to restrain these racial depredations. They founded a new nation rooted in revolutionary liberal ideals of individual freedom and representative government, but they deliberately excluded racialized others from equal status participation in this project. After a bloody civil war and decades of struggle, this status quo rooted in racist violence persists. From this perspective, the problem of racism is a defining feature of the American project, something that requires a revolutionary intervention if American society is to achieve the lofty ideals to which it claims to aspire. These different constructions of American history and identity likely informed a profound gap in perception of racism in U.S. society that we mentioned in the introduction. In our contribution for the Anti-Racism Incorporated collection, we take this ubiquitous gap in perceptions of reality, whereby white Americans tend to perceive less racism in everyday life and foundational institutions of U.S. society than do people from a variety of racialized ethnic minority groups, as a way to discuss the colonization of consciousness. Discussions of this idea emphasize that conventional or hegemonic understandings are not neutral reflections on objective reality from disinterested observers with a view from nowhere in particular. Rather, they are situated understandings from an epistemic perspective of whiteness that have become common sense via the projection of racial and colonial power. Regardless of one's social identities, participation in mainstream knowledge forms tend to colonize perception, affording understandings of everyday reality that reflect white epistemic perspectives and effective sensibilities and promote interests of white racial power. So to you guys who are with me live today, I want to thank you guys for being here. When you guys think of white power or white nationhood, what comes to mind? What two things first come to mind when you think about white power and white nationhood? I'll read your answers off live on the show when I get them. So, how is one to understand racial group preferences in perception of racism? Prevailing accounts in hegemonic psychological science typically focus on claims of racism by people in ethnic minority communities as the deviant phenomenon that requires explanation. Direct or blatant expressions of this orientation are incredulous reactions to claims of racism and dismissal of claims as an example of playing the race card, right? Which is also part of that deception, right? Playing the race card, because when you see there's symbology that goes on in a statement like playing the race card, right? It makes you think of playing a game, like you're just playing a game, you know, something silly. And so that's how they just kind of brush it off, right? When you're talking about serious racial matters. Oh, you're just clowning around, you're just playing a game, you're playing the race card. Purportedly strategic move to exaggerate racial grievance, right? Tim Wise, this is a footnote to that note. Tim Wise, what kind of card is race? The absurdity and consistency of white denial is cited here. I don't know. Well, yeah, okay. A more subtle expression of this orientation is the tendency for journalists, scientists, and pollsters to report on group differences in ways that set up white patterns as the unremarkable standard from which racial others deviate. In particular, such reports are likely to frame differences in perception of racism as blacks more likely to say race is a factor, when an equally accurate description of results is that whites are less likely to say that race is a factor. Right? So they, again, it's this word game, and it's just based off of more deception, right? So when they say it as blacks are more likely to say, you know, it comes across as, well, black people are always saying something, blah blah blah, you know. But the reality of it is, it's equally effective to say the other way. Whites are less likely to say that race is a factor, and that's a fact. And you know, that also goes to like the issue of reparations. You know, one of the many reasons why reparations won't be achieved is that you're gonna have white folks who say, well, my people, you know, I didn't have slaves. You know, my ancestors didn't have slaves. Only blah, blah, blah % of white folks had slaves, and blah, 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 right? Knowingly denying, right? And pretending not to know that their privilege, their access, you know, their ability to build wealth is all based off the free labor of our enslaved ancestors, right? And so, and the whole cottage industry that the movement of our enslaved ancestors created. But they won't talk about that. They just talk about, well, you know, my ancestors didn't do nothing, and to them, that's the end of the story. And so when these are the people that you got to try to convince to give you repair, you ain't getting it from these people. You just won't get it from these people. Not that they like you enough any damn way to give it to you, but just off the argument alone, they're gonna rebut your argument every time with, you know, with what I just said. In the chat room, to my question about what do you think about what do you picture when you think about white nations? Renee says the KKK, Birth of a Nation, global imperialism, and Christianity. And if you think about, what Renee says here, the KKK is a local, it's a local propaganda scheme that was set up to instill fear in local communities. The global imperialism is the one that has every African person, no matter where they are on the globe. It has us caught up, or I should say pinned down by it. And Christianity is the white ideology that really makes us lethargic, makes us docile, makes us feel that this existence on this planet at this time is nothing really, because there's a better existence to be lived in the next world. Let me tell you something. If white folks really believed that you were going to live in a house with many mansions upon death because you did certain ritualistic things, pray and fast and tithe and all that old shit, they would never have given you that shit to begin with. Because the way their mind works, they ain't gonna let you have a powerful nation in the afterlife. They ain't gonna let you be equals with them in the afterlife. So, gentle reminder, give that shit up. This typical mode of interpretation constructs white American perceptions of limited racism as an unremarkable standard of racial objectivity. Measured against this standard, the tendency in mainstream institutions is to pathologize perception of racism. Mild versions construct Black American perception of racism as a form of perpetual baggage, right? Excessive stigma consciousness, racial rejection, sensitivity, or willingness to believe in conspiracy theories. You see, this is what they have boiled you down to, right? This is how they counter your righteous claim. This is how they counter your righteous claim. Historically, more versions have linked Black American perceptions of racism with irrational fear and akin to paranoia. So here's the problem. Here's the thing about that statement. There's some truth to that statement, and that some truth comes from the fact that a lot of our Black folks are not engaged in intellectual thinking. They're not engaged in intellectual reading. They're not engaged in an organization where you have folks, who have done the aforementioned things. They're intellectual, they read, they strategize, etc. And so what has happened is we have a bunch of grifters, and I know I talk about this damn near every week, but it's something that needs to be said and said again until more of our people get it. The grifters, for them to be able to continuously grift off of you, they have to keep you afraid. They have to keep you paranoid, right? For example, a very popular Black grifter will jump online, right, do a YouTube live stream, and as you've seen with me, sometimes I have problems, the internet drops out, especially when I first started live streaming. Right, the internet will drop out and all this kind of stuff. And this popular Black grifter would say, "Oh, look, the white supremacists are messing with my stream." And so you could see that person's listeners kind of cheering that on and say, "Yeah, man, they messing with you." At one time, this grifter that I speak of even started to say, "Hey, when they mess with my stream, or when you see you know, the white supremacists come into my, my live chat and they're saying stuff, donate to my Cash App. Right? These guys are running game. Playing off of this fear and this paranoia. You know, again, last thing I'll say about this particular grifter, but I've heard others say it too. You know, like nowhere on the planet can you go and be free of the white supremacists. Well, how is that true? How is that true when there's places on the planet where there's very little of them to us? The only problem that we have, right, is that through colonialism and the grip that they still held after colonialism, we still have them doing some behind the scenes workings with sellout leaders in these black countries. That's from the Caribbean to the continent itself. You see, the thing about it is, people, I've talked about this in recent weeks, when you have the resources, i.e. the money, to pay off leaders to work against the interests of their people, that's what we gotta organize against. That's really what we gotta do. But this idea that these folks are untouchable and they could get you anywhere and all that, that's boogeyman talk. Again, I'll repeat, under the current paradigm of things, they have power because they're in every country. Like I talked about in the last episode, these guys have a military base in just about every country, right? They got the resources, i.e. the money, the wealth, to throw behind a couple of million behind a sellout, right? Who will turn against his own people, his or her own people, and sell them out. That's what we got to get at. But right, to say that they're the smartest people. In fact, the same grifter I'm talking about has even been seen saying like these white folks are like gods. They're the smartest people on the planet. Bullshit. They're just the most organized. And unfortunately, before I get back to the paper, unfortunately, and this is really the hard thing for me to reconcile sometimes. Unfortunately, we've allowed them to get such a head start that we have to be real tight, really on our P's and Q's going forward to catch up and to overpower them, to get these people up off of us. This is why I talk about, you know, sometimes if you listen in the past, you'll hear me having talked about like all of this nonsense in the streets with dudes shooting each other and all this kind of stuff. We really got to stop that. I understand that crime is, you know, people will pull up the stats, crime in white society, crime in black is virtually the same. And I understand that crime is a thing, right? But what I'm saying is, when you're at war, you can't afford to have friendly fire. You can't afford to be taking out more of your soldiers, more of the people who you need on the battlefield. So when I say thing, I'm not trying to be an ideologue in that sense, but I am saying we have to be better. We have to have a standard and a so-called code amongst us, right? Where we're not taking out each other, where we're not selling the drugs to our own people and messing up our own people. You know, there's certain things we do have to regulate for us to be better, and so for us to be better at overthrowing the, you know, powers that be that are on our neck. Black Americans who express a general mistrust of white society, for example, cultural mistrust, were more likely to be misdiagnosed as schizophrenic or otherwise disturbed. That's heavy. That's heavy how far these guys will go. Damn. These constructions of racism perception as paranoia or exaggeration imply that black communities are somewhat out of touch with reality in ways that white communities are not. And, I see it, I'm on Facebook and I see the New York Times posting stuff. And the New York Times posted an article, I want to say it was this morning, saying that, let me see if I could find it real quick. But it was saying that there were these racial reasons for why a lot of black kids or black kids in the black community weren't going back to school or something. Just give me 1 second. Let me see if I could find it. A New York Times article. Yeah. Anytime you want to do something quick, that's when technology moves slow, isn't it? Yeah, so it was called A Racial Divide in Reopened Classrooms. More white than black children. And underneath the comments of that article, right, the racial divide and reopened classrooms, more white than black children. Under the article, that's where you see all the so-called white liberals. That's where you see them pouring in, talking about they got to fix their community. Then they'll care about education, talking about black folks and all this kind of stuff. And, this is what, again, these are, judging by the pictures, by the thumbnail, these are old white people. You see, they too have drank some of the, their nationhood Kool-Aid. So a lot of them, when they hear a black person in a courtroom and they're on the jury or whatever, they play dumb, or maybe they are dumb because they're completely indoctrinated. Either way is dangerous for us. Right? They act like we're crazy. Ain't no racism out here. You're crazy. All these examples of these Karens calling the cops, there's white folks looking at that thinking, she did nothing wrong. So if she did nothing wrong, that means that we have to be the crazy ones. We're the ones out of touch with reality. We're the ones who are making up, this claim of racism, etc. In summary, hegemonic knowledge systems obscure the operation of racial power and enable otherwise civic-minded people to insulate themselves from knowledge of their participation in the ongoing subordination of global humanity. I like how they wrote that. Social justice advocates seek to illuminate the everyday racism of modern society in order to resist it. In response, defenders of social order seek to incorporate, domesticate, and assimilate understandings about racism, primarily considering it as an individual bias and hostile racial animus, in ways that do not fundamentally disrupt the status quo. In this way, the definition and perception of racism becomes a central site of social struggle. That brings us to a section called Decolonizing Perception and Consciousness. Let's take a quick station ID, and I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And we're back. I'm your host, Koku, discussing another paper. This time we're discussing Decolonizing Consciousness. Before I continue the paper, I just want to say that, listen to all those shows just mentioned on KWAZ Radio, but one that's not mentioned is the Queen's Council. Make sure tune in, make sure subscribe to her YouTube channel and tune in, as she should be dropping something new soon. And also, I've been approached about this a couple times, and honestly, I'm flattered that people would ask me about this stuff, but I can't do all this stuff anymore. People have asked me about the book club. I would love the book club to continue, except I don't want to, host it. It's something I've been meaning to talk to Carl Hezekiah about. Maybe he'd be interested in hosting it. Maybe if I could get him a co-host, that'd be great. If you're interested in hosting the book club, let me know. We'll talk about it. We'll definitely get that going again. If I could get people to host a show. I've been asked about a show that, that brings together conscious sisters. I would love to be involved in getting that off the ground too. If you are a conscious sister, you have a circle of conscious sisters, or even if you're just by yourself and you're looking to build this circle, let me know again. I'll help wherever I can to get that going. It'll be nice to have a podcast with sisters, talking about, topical issues and historical issues of African women, Black women. So let me know about that as well. And again, don't forget, I have the Discord where we're building this African Center curriculum. If you want to be a part of that, let me know as well how, just ask me how to join. So the next section of this paper is Decolonizing Perception Consciousness. Resistance to the incorporation of anti-racism requires strategies for decolonizing consciousness. The activity of intellectual decolonization is necessary both to counteract the often apparently progressive forms of knowledge and promote ignorance about ongoing social domination, and to illuminate ways of being that ensure a more just and sustainable existence for the impoverished global majority. Although very much a theoretical exercise, the task of intellectual decolonization is a key element of the practical struggle against racism and injustice. This imperative task of resistance has commonalities across a variety of liberatory thought traditions, for example, decolonial, critical race, and liberation theology philosophy, and global social movements, for example, Black Power, Chicanx, American Indian, Negritude, Pan-African, and Indian independence movements. Just want to go back to that last point that talked about this imperative task of resistance has commonalities across a variety of liberatory thought traditions, for example, decolonial, critical race, and liberation theology philosophy. There's a footnote to that says, for example, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, 20 Years of Critical Race Theory, Looking Back to Move Forward, Connecticut Law Review, number 43, number 5, in 2010, pages 12 to 53. Also, Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, right? And a few other works here are cited as part of this, resistance, right? And showing these commonalities. Moving on. Though the idea of decolonizing consciousness itself does not reflect a single genealogy, it takes inspiration from several 20th century scholars and activists, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Mahatma Gandhi, Amy Cesare, Franz Fanon, and Gloria Anza Idua, among many others. You know, anytime I hear Mahatma Gandhi, well, in fact, anytime you hear Mahatma Gandhi, understand that what he was talking about wasn't meant for us. In writing about colonial resistance, they each illuminate the epistemic violence by which global institutions forcefully impose understandings and practices from powerful geopolitical centers to relatively powerless peripheries in ways that maintain systems of exploitation and domination. Intellectual frameworks derived from these thought traditions advocate preferential consideration for epistemic perspectives of oppressed peoples as a privileged standpoint from which to understand everyday life in modern global order. Applied to the present case of differences in perception of racism, the idea of a preferential epistemic option implies taking subordinated group experience as a standpoint for understanding everyday events. Associated with this approach are two provisional strategies for decolonizing consciousness: normalizing racism perception and denaturalizing racism denial. We refer to these strategies as provisional in two senses of the word, both A, something in process awaiting refinement, and B, something useful to bring on a journey. In similar fashion, the idea of decolonizing consciousness refers both to the process of interrogating existing tools for the production of particular kinds of unconsciousness and the production of knowledge tools that are useful for this purpose. Now, depending on what these tools are, right, they could, again, we do these episodes as a part of the building the Afrocentric curriculum. Depending on the tools, these tools might be useful in getting through to our young people especially, but both young and old, right? Because again, remember, we talk about like this curriculum and curriculum in general is supposed to boost the self-esteem of the learner. And if we could get folks out of this, if we could get folks to understand, right, get them out of what they're currently thinking that all is lost, and get them to understand that if you work, if you build, right, you can change this. You could change the situation. You could reverse it, right? If you look at our history and who we were and where we were, we could change things going forward, right? Sometimes you gotta read this type of material to get ideas, to get more ideas on how we go forward. How do we implement certain, knowledge-based tools or what have you to really get our people where we need to be mentally? The first strategy for decolonization of consciousness is to provide a context-sensitive, normalizing account of other patterns that hegemonic accounts and psychological science regard as abnormal. Rather than lack of contact with reality, this normalizing strategy suggests that one, consider how apparently paranoid perceptions of racism may reflect engagement with ecologically valid forms of knowledge that promote racial consciousness. Okay. As an example of this strategy, consider our work on the Mali hypothesis. The idea that perception of racism in U.S. society reflects accurate knowledge about historical, documented instances of past racism. The idea that the perception of racism in U.S. society reflects accurate knowledge about historical, documented instances of past racism. Black and white Americans completed a true-false test of statements about incidents of racism in U.S. history. black participants performed better on the test. That is, they were more likely than the white participants to confidently identify historically documented instances of racism as true, but they were no more likely to incorrectly identify fake fictional items as true. And this black-white difference in accurate knowledge of past racism accounted for the black-white differences in perception of present-day racism. The normalizing implication is that black American tendencies to perceive racism are not distortions of reality, for example, strategic exaggeration, but instead constitute realistic concerns about enduring manifestations of racism that are finely attuned to accurate knowledge about American history. You know, one of the things I always found just simply amazing, and it still happens every now and again. Like for example, just a few years ago, I think maybe when Trump got into office, there was a commercial, and one of the people in the commercial, you know, it was a few black people, male, female. And one of the people in the commercial was Van Jones, crying ass Van Jones, right? And Van Jones was saying that he was like 20 or something, 19 or 20, when he learned about racism or had a racist encounter. I think it was learned about racism, or you know, maybe more so encountered racism. But I found that mind-blowing, and I've heard different black folks say that over the years. Now, if you had the right curriculum, you would know about racism from pre-K, right? You wouldn't fall victim to like what they've been trying to do, that this paper mentions, change the textbooks to say that they imported workers from Africa, for example, right? But it's amazing to see, you know, we still have black folks who could reach adult ages or young adult ages and not be assured that there was racism. But this part of the paper here points out something that should be, you know, I would have thought to be pretty obvious, right? But again, you see white folks playing dumb. Do you guys in the chat room, or those of you listening to the replay later on, you could post your answers in the comment section. Do you guys really think these white folks who took this test really performed worse because they knew little? Or you think they were playing dumb? I tend to think they're playing dumb. Look, we've got pictures. You could go online right now. You could watch pictures of lynchings with a multitude, I'm not exaggerating when I say that, a multitude of white dudes and white women stand up there smiling, and white children. You're telling me y'all don't know about the historical racism and can't connect it to what's going on now? No, it's just deception. They're playing dumb. The second strategy for decolonization of consciousness is to turn the analytical lens back on hegemonic knowledge forms to denaturalize the patterns that these forms portray as a just natural standard. In the present case, the hegemonic knowledge form is the unmarked and unnamed white norm to minimize or deny racism in U.S. society and the modern global order. All right, so now we're talking some sense here. You know, these folks are doing this intentionally. Applied to this case, this strategy of denaturalization suggests that white American tendencies are not an unremarkable reflection of objective reality. Instead, they reflect cultural, psychological processes that lead people to minimize or deny the true extent of racism. From this perspective, the phenomenon that requires explanation in not only subordinated group perception of racism, i.e. blacks, see more racism, but also dominant group denial of racism, i.e. whites, see less racism. Racism denial is not a natural reflection of objective reality, but reflects operation of important sociocultural and psychological processes. Our own and others' research generally points to two sources of white racism denial. One source is motivated perception or wishful thinking. Perception of racism in U.S. society is threatening to white identity because the continuity of past and present racism calls into question the merit of whites' advantage status, the morality of the nation, and the broader legitimacy of the status quo. As a result of these identity threats, white Americans are motivated to deny the pervasiveness of racism in American society. When researchers use experimental techniques, for example, self-affirmation strategies, to temporarily neutralize these society identity threats, they observe that white Americans perceive greater racism and are more willing to acknowledge systemic forms of racism and privilege. In the chat room, KW Don 7 says, Van Jones is lame. He told a story about how Urugu spat in his drink without his knowledge, but he still managed to marry, yeah. He still managed to marry a white female. Yeah. It's almost, I almost have no words for what Van Jones represents. And let's be clear, Van Jones is not the only one like that. Not the only one like that. Unfortunately, we have this sense amongst Black society that you get a white person on your arm, you are better than the rest now. You've been validated, and that's most of the people, if not all, who engage in such miscegenation, right? And it's a shame. A second source of white denial of racism is cultural knowledge. Even if people could put aside identity defensive motivations and weigh questions about racism in an unbiased fashion, a focus on cultural knowledge suggests that white Americans might still deny the extent of racism in the U.S. because they lack information about and experience with racism relevant realities. In other words, white Americans fail to perceive racism because they inhabit information ecologies that enable them to remain ignorant about the extent of racism in the U.S. society. Well, no doubt. One example of relevant cultural knowledge is representations of history. Just as Black American perceptions of racism have roots in greater knowledge of historical racism, white American denials of racism have roots in greater ignorance of historical racism. As we discuss in a subsequent section, representations of history vary in their attention to past racism, and this variation has consequences for perception of present-day racism. Again, as research on the Mali hypothesis demonstrates, accurate knowledge about incidents of past racism is associated with tendencies to perceive greater racism in present-day society. So here's the thing. When you're at war, there's something called propaganda, right? And the propaganda is intended to steer the minds and the emotions of the people that you're trying to ignite, right? And so what did the powers that be, what have they done? The powers that be have told their people, right, over the years, that racism is just a thing of the past. Yeah, your grandpappy was lynching folks, but that was back in the day. It was a crazy time, et cetera, et cetera. And then they came right behind that and they said, well, look, it wasn't that bad. It was only like 5,000 lynchings or something in all of America, right? It wasn't that bad. And so what they've done, they've distanced themselves from the historic record, and slowly the powers that be, right? That's why you have these textbooks that, from my understanding, textbooks have to be approved. The contents of the textbooks have to be approved for them to be put into use. So they approve that. They want to kind of dumb down, or I shouldn't say dumb down, but they want to take away the impact of what racism was in this country, in the US. But that's a part of propaganda. Propaganda, a lot of people don't recognize this immediately, but propaganda is used to make you correct in whatever the argument is. And your correctness is validated by the people agreeing with what it is you're saying, right? When Germany did what they did, they were able to get the people to go along with it. So my question is, what propaganda are we creating for our people? KW Don 7 in the chat room says that the only people who are ignorant about the white hegemonic system, aka racism, white supremacy, are African people. KW Don and anyone else who wants to answer this in the chat room, pray tell me what's the thing that you think most has African people blinded by this white hegemonic system? What's the thing that has, is it sexual access that has them blinded? Like, is it the idea that they can have the same wealth? What is it that has African people so blinded to what's obviously there? Is it the black grifters? Is it the black voices telling black folks that, there's this boogeyman, and, what is it exactly? What do you think it is, right? So this brings us to another section called Contesting Incorporation, Tools for Colonial and Decolonial Consciousness. The problem with classic distinction between motivated and informal sources' perpetual bias is that it can treat information sources as politically neutral or disinterested cultural differences. In other words, it fails to understand the extent to which different cultural realities are intentional worlds, sites of struggle invested with beliefs and desires of people who create and reproduce them. Let me read that again. In other words, it fails to understand the extent to which different cultural realities are intentional worlds, sites of struggle invested with beliefs and desires of people who create and reproduce them. An emphasis on the intentionality of everyday worlds highlights the extent to which hegemonic institutions in U.S. society have evolved in accordance with the imperative to promote white comfort. White racial power exerts pressure on the evolution of cultural forms as cultural gatekeepers select understandings of history and society that promote white comfort and omit or deselect understandings that promote white discomfort. So again, I ask a question. What are we doing to counter this, right? For example, this is what happens in the school system, right? In Texas or wherever it was, Arkansas or wherever, they have this textbook talking about enslaved Africans were imported from Africa. Something that sounds kind of decent, right? Sounds nice. We imported them, and then they add on to that as workers, right? Totally bypassing the brutality, the theft, right? But that's how these folks teach their next generations coming up. Like, we didn't do anything wrong. And again, this is why you won't get reparations. We didn't do anything wrong, right? But what are you doing at home? Because your kids are not getting into schools. What are you doing to counter this in your own home? Renee says, ultimately the white savior complex. Blacks looks to whites to save them. And that's nothing but the truth. That's nothing but the truth, right? Implicit in that response is that, religion plays a big role in what's going on. Do you think it's a coincidence that most conscious Black people have thrown or cast aside religion? Most conscious folks out here have cast aside religion, have tried to get back to African spirituality or the agnostic or what have you, but most of them have cast aside religion, right? But again, the question is a question that we all need to be working towards the answer for, right? We have to teach our own lessons to counter this bullshit. This is the domain of anti-racism incorporated. Institutions that have emerged, sometimes intentionally, but often unwittingly through acts of barely conscious selection based on unrecognized preferences, because they serve needs of people advantaged by domination to produce constructions of reality that represent and define racism safely. They serve needs of people advantaged by domination to produce constructions of reality. Yeah, that's the thing too. Like, years ago, I had a guy at this lab I used to work in. He was, I was his direct report, right? He was a young guy, around 19, 20. And I remember in my conversations with him, he would speak as though him and, white kids his age were viewed or treated the same. And I used to have to school him on some shit. And there were some things he knew, which was so bizarre. Like, there were some things he realized he had known, but in actuality, he lived in a way where, like, yeah, I'm gonna go hang with these white kids at a bar and all this kind of stuff. And I told him, dude, you never want to be the one Black guy around a bunch of white folks like that. How many of you have grown up around parents or something who've told you something similar? Mom, Dad, a bunch of my white friends are going down. We're gonna go hunting in the woods. No, stay your ass home. You're not taking your ass out there with these people. But because a lot of our people have this perception, especially in the youth, that it's all, it's all equality, it's all the same, it's all good. We are the ones, it's our youth, because we send them out there as sheep amongst these wolves. We mess them up because there's an age where it catches up, and it comes pretty quickly, typically. Right? So what I'm trying to say here in this example is, all due respect to that young brother, but his mother didn't prepare him right. you have to prepare the youth around you correctly. Okay? You have to prepare the youth around you correctly. And so you have to produce these constructions of reality, right? That define racism correctly. I wouldn't even say safely, but correctly. That puts us in the right perspective of the reality that we live in. Like only time said, a population within a nation. Man, once you start, let me tell you something. If you start off your understanding of life, that you are merely a population, you belong to a population within a, not just any nation, a white nation. Trust me, that will change so much of what you do and so much of how you carry yourself going forward. And because we tend not to do it, as KW Don 7 said earlier, we're the only ones as African people. We're the only ones who are ignorant to this hegemonic system, aka white supremacy, white racism, right? You know, we fail ourselves when we do that. That's what I'll say. In the chat room, KW Don 7 says, part of the problem is that a large amount of black collectives still worship Urugu as some kind of deity, i.e. Jesus Christ. Absolutely. Renee says, ultimately the white savior complex, blacks look to whites to save them. I said that before. KW Don came back and said, we have not come to terms with our historical relationship with Urugu. By the way, if you don't know, Urugu just means white, white people. We failed to identify them as our sworn enemy and act accordingly. Excellently, well said. When there's war, there's an enemy. Who is your enemy? And when you understand who your enemy is, you won't be, by chance from America and acting like I am, or, some other Caribbean person is your enemy. Or acting like some African is your enemy. Let me tell you something. Growing up in the Caribbean, we never thought of no African as our enemy. I've never heard that discussed, that some African or African American was our enemy. We understood what the real enemy was. We understood who it was, especially considering, where I'm from, independence just occurred about 3 years before I was born. We knew exactly, to this day, right? Like Wilder would say, to this day, we know who the enemy is, and that's what we got to get back to. We have to clearly, like KW Don 7 says in the chat room, we have to clearly identify who is our sworn enemy. And I like the use of the word sworn because it means that it ain't just some regular old enemy. This ain't no little childlike enemy type shit. This is real enemy. When we understand that, we'll act accordingly. I Am Sudan says, I found your channel a couple of days ago. Keep up the good work, brother. I appreciate that, I Am Sudan. I Am Sudan, are you actually in Sudan? Right? Identify your enemy. And we gotta get our kids on to understand that. There was a thing about I think last year, where these two kids, a black kid and a white kid, saw each other at a distance and was running towards each other, hugging. And the black kid was giddy. And I cringed, to be honest. I cringed my ass off when I saw it. Even if they went to school together or something, you give that fella the hot tip hello. You know that where you put your little two fingers up in there. Hey, what's up? You keep it moving. But it was something that his black parent, didn't prepare him for. Probably doesn't even see the need. If his black parent, mother or whoever, was listening to this show, they'll probably be appalled by what I'm saying. and by what you guys are saying in the chat room. We got to change that. We have the ability to change that. It begins at home. So this brings us to the next section. Wait, hold on. I Am Sudan says, I live in Utah. Okay. Okay, you must stand out. You must stand out a lot in Utah. I Am Sudan. Incorporating Black history, celebrating diversity, or ignoring racism. Incorporating Black history, right? Is it celebrating diversity or ignoring racism? When Carter G. Woodson created the institution of Black History Month, BHM, he believed that the commemoration practice not only would instill racial pride within the African American community, but also would introduce an anti-racist consciousness among white Americans. Wishful thinking. As mainstream America, and you know, we gotta stop doing this wishful thinking thing too. We really gotta stop thinking that we could change the minds of these savages. That's the other thing we need to recognize. It's not just a sworn enemy, they are savages that we are enemies with. You're not gonna persuade them. You know, MLK thought for some reason he could go out there and get suited and booted on a Sunday and take a cut ass. Right? And think about some elements of those cut asses that they were taking out there. Your boy who died the other day, who looks like Buddy Healed. I forgot his name now. Good Trouble, right? You went out there and got your head bashed in. You had police dogs, fire department water hoses, state troopers beating y'all asses, and y'all thought this cut ass, someone's wife or something will see this and they'll have a change of heart. Bullshit. People, if they didn't have a change of heart when they were cutting babies out of women and lynching them and burning them and stomping the baby to death, they didn't have a change of heart when they was lynching black men and cutting off their manhood and passing around fingertips and severed manhood and all that around from family to family. If they didn't have a change of heart, in fact, the fact that they did that, they ain't gonna change no hearts. Stop thinking you could change these people's heart. As mainstream American society increasingly incorporated BHM, this cultural tool evolved to serve a variety of different purposes. Some expressions of BHM, for example, advertisements for Budweiser proclaiming that this chapter of history brought to you by the King of Beer, are clearly tangential or even antithetical to the original purpose of anti-racism education. Imagine that, right? Imagine I'm doing this podcast and in the middle of it, you hear this podcast is brought to you by the King of Beer. Like, come on. In such cases, BHM becomes another opportunity for corporations to advertise products to a niche market and thereby profit at the expense of oppressed communities. Again, what does that tell you about the people you're dealing with? However, even expression of BHM that share the goal of anti-racism education can vary in effectiveness. Many institutions have incorporated BHM into school programming and curricula for educational purposes. But it is not clear to what extent these efforts have realized Woodson's original mission of promoting anti-racism. They've done nothing. Nothing. It's just an activity at this point. Renee says to I Am Sudan that I Am Sudan is living in Utah. She said Utah. Wow, I agree. Utah. Okay. In general, representations of American history tend to glorify the heroic efforts of a few individuals and to sanitize identity-threatening versions of the past. The desire to silence events and re-emphasize the good of the nation are amplified in cases where the events under consideration, enslavement, rape and torture, segregation, and terroristic violence, are crimes against humanity. Read that again. The desire to silence events and re-emphasize the good of the nation are amplified in cases where the events under consideration, such as enslavement, rape and torture, segregation, and terroristic violence, are crimes against humanity. This raises a problem for the incorporation of BHM commemoration practices into mainstream U.S. society, because such violent events are central to the collective narrative identity of Black Americans. Despite its relevance to the topic, research that we conducted in Midwest U.S. high schools revealed that BHM commemorations typically silence memory of such violence via at least two sanitizing strategies. One strategy is to highlight individual Black American achievement, whether inventors, intellectuals, or civil rights heroes, while minimizing the historical barriers that these individuals faced or the collective struggle to eliminate those barriers. Another strategy is to direct discussions about Black history toward multicultural tolerance and diversity instead of focusing on the ongoing legacy of systemic expropriation, exploitation, and violent oppression. We saw this strategy appear to a greater extent in predominantly white schools, where BHM materials highlighted contemporary issues of multiculturalism and diversity rather than historical events specifically. You know, another part of why the education is done this way too is because, and this is historical as well, you know, to oppress a people and you being a part of the people doing the oppressing, right? The propaganda machine has to be turned on because I have to make you, you know, feel like what we're doing is correct, right? I kind of mentioned this earlier, but I'm just emphasizing it here again. So in the school systems, right, the flip side to that is in the school systems, they won't teach these up and coming white racists, right? They won't teach them of, you know, the real atrocities. Yeah, you're talking about MLK, but talk about the fact that y'all shot him in his face and killed him, right? You know, and the list goes on of all the atrocities you've carried out. But you'll talk about them in these good ways, but you don't talk about the hurdles they had to climb. You don't talk about the, you know, the ultimate demise, etc. And you know, that's the other part of the education that goes on in the school system. You sanitize the true history of these folks. You don't talk about MLK's demise the way you should. You don't talk about his brother, you know, turning up drowned, his mother shot and killed. You don't talk about those things. You don't talk about, you know, some of the things that went on during his time, or 4 girls were bombed in a Black church. You don't talk about those things because you want your people, these white kids, to think that all was, you know, all was well. It was fine. Black folks had the same opportunities as us. It was fine, but that's a part of the game. And again, it is clear that when you're talking about curriculum building today, African-centered, you have to tell the full story. Starting with the kids. If a 5-year-old has to learn that they shot, you know, they shot MLK through the face, so be it. If they have to learn about the demise of Patrice Lumumba, so be it. Let it get through to them early and put a face to it. Put a face and a race and a color to it. Let them know exactly who are the perpetrators. In the chat room, Renee says, Black History Month is the same 3 to 4 Black historical figures year after year. Black institutions do no better at informing our community of Black history than white institutions or corporations. That's because Black institutions take the, thanks for that comment, Renee. Black institutions take their direction from white ones. So they're just the mouthpieces, just saying the same shit white people say. To illustrate how constructions of history afford reproduction of ignorance, first consider implications for the focus of anti-racism efforts. Acceptable anti-racism efforts within mainstream U.S. institutions require incorporation of sanitized narratives that maintain an image of the U.S. and its citizens as ultimately good. In the case of BHM, mainstream institutions affirm their dedication to diversity versus social justice by celebrating BHM with the stories highlighting the many contributions of African Americans to U.S. history. The presence of and this idea here, you know, that's been the game in the U.S. for a very long time. You know, during the Great Depression, they had these programs that, you know, a lot of Black folks were able to participate in. And it made it, according to history, it made it so that Black folks didn't suffer as bad as they could have. And some say not even as bad as white folks, which I call that into question. But the thing about those programs, they were just programs set up. They did nothing for racial justice, you know, social justice, racial justice. They did nothing for racial equality or none of that because these folks don't care about that. The presence of celebratory narratives helps us remember the events about which we can be proud. At the same time, the silences embedded in historical erasure facilitate collective forgetting of those events that afford shame or guilt. The problem with reproducing sanitized versions of history is that instead of critically addressing the relationship between historical racism and present-day equality, silence about racism obscures this relationship. I 100% agree. So for our children, we got to give it to them face on. We got to give them the unadulterated, unfiltered truth. Slavery, Jim Crow, and other forms of state-sanctioned violence are at the foundation of many social, psychological, economic, and structural barriers manifest in current-day racial disparities. Silence about these historical realities in BHM, Black History Month, commemorations promotes collective forgetting and deflects attention away from structural barriers that continue to impact people of African descent. And the thing is, it not only does it promote collective white forgetting, more importantly, it promotes Black forgetting, collective Black forgetting, right? We go along with the bullshit talking about MLK all day too. I'm not talking about the fact that, you know, the King of Peace or whatever it's, or, you know, whatever moniker they had given them at the time, you know, they shot that dude in the face. Like the emphasis on tolerance and diversity, the emphasis on heroic and individual achievement also deflects attention from structural barriers. However, this emphasis has the added advantage of resonating with such dominant group ideologies as colorblindness, meritocracy, and Protestant work ethic. These ideologies afford the tendency to blame minority group disadvantage on group characteristics rather than systemic forces embedded in the foundations of American society. You know? So like when I talked about that thing in the New York Times about New York schools and more whites are going back to school and black kids, and you see old white dudes in the comment section talking about they gotta fix their community to appreciate education. Shut up. It's more of this type of stuff going on right here that what you see a lot of, especially these older white folks out here pushing all the time. This brings us to the next section, implications for perception of racism. I'm going to take a quick station ID. I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
All right, we're back, and we're at the part of the paper called Implications for Perception of Racism. Make sure to check out the Queen's Council, like I mentioned before. Make sure to check out Onitase and the organization that he's building and the work that he's doing. Ask him how you can help. And again, the project for this podcast is to build construct a new African-centered curriculum. So a lot of these episodes that I've been doing of late is research towards that, right? You'll notice I keep bringing it back to learning, education, curriculum, because you can't talk about nation building and not talk about education. And you can't talk about nation building and not discuss war. So we're talking about education today in terms of decolonizing consciousness. So we add this section called Implications for Perception of Racism. Similar to predominantly white schools, representations of BHM from predominantly black schools also emphasize black individual achievement. In contrast, and unlike predominantly white schools, representations of BHM in predominantly black schools made more explicit references to historical racism. This difference in emphasis has important implications for perception of racism and support for anti-racist policy. In particular, empirical evidence from 2 studies indicated that BHM representations typical of schools where black students were in the majority were more effective at promoting perceptions of racism in U.S. society compared to BHM representations typical of predominantly white schools. Well, of course, but here's the thing. What is the goal of these Black History Month representations typical in black schools or schools that have predominantly black students? What is the end goal? See, and that's one of the big failings of curriculum. Remember, when we talk about curriculum or African-centered curriculum, we're talking about something by where a student gets the knowledge, the background knowledge, and the understanding of how to solve problems in their community, for their people in their community. And so if you're doing BHM, right, Black History Month, if you're doing Black History Month and you're actually, getting into the racism that existed in Black history, you have to have an endpoint for what that's meant to do. I'll go back to what KW Don says in the chat room, that you have to understand, right, and designate who is your mortal enemy. So if these Black History Month celebrations aren't digging in and telling you, look, man, this is your enemy. Look at these guys at, at these lynchings, for example, right? Some of their descendants have been your school teachers, have been the loan officer at the bank. This is your enemy, and understand you can't get any victories from your enemy unless you beat them. So this is what Black History Month is supposed to be. A little background information on myself. I used to be a part of a collective in college that used to put on for 2 or 3 years, we put on the Black History Month celebrations, and everyone said it was wildly different than Black History Month celebrations on campus that they had ever seen before. We kept it African-centered, right? We kept it as a celebration of our Africanness and our Blackness, and also we kept it, who is our enemy? And that's what needs to be done here. In the first study, participants engaged with actual BHM materials, sampled from commemoration displays in predominantly Black or white Midwestern high schools. In the second study, participants engaged with BHM narratives inspired by the differences we observed in the materials. Celebratory representations of Black history that emphasize past achievements of Black Americans, critical representations that emphasize historical instances of racism, or mainstream representations of U.S. history that rendered people of African descent invisible. Participants exposed to critical representations not only perceived greater racism in U.S. society, but also indicated greater support for policies designed to ameliorate racial inequality than the participants in the other two conditions. The impact of critical history knowledge on perception is important because in both studies, perceptions of racism facilitated support for anti-racism policies. This research helps to illuminate how white institutional spaces reproduce racism by promoting constructions of the past that fail to mention instances of racial oppression. Sanitized representations of the past minimize perception of racism in present, which undermines support for anti-racism policies. So again, this is one of those papers, and by now you should expect anything that's out there in the mainstream to do as much. But this is again kind of pandering to changing the minds of white folks. But when I read this paper, and hopefully you can tell this, I'm not really checking for the changing the white minds. I'm checking for how can the paper be used to change our minds and change our strategy, right? Change how we work our strategy going forward. This brings us to the section called Defining Racism Safely, the Prejudice Problematic. In the chat room, though, I Am Sudan says, Black institutions rely on whites, and so follow along with this. Black institutions rely on whites, and J3WSs, or dollar signs, you know who that is, for funds in exchange. They undermine curriculum. Again, you can't set yourself free while eating from your enemies. Yeah, you cannot rely on your enemies to feed you. That goes by feed. I'm talking about spiritually, economically, monetarily, etc. You cannot rely on them to feed you. And be careful what you consume. Thanks for the comment. I am Sudan. By the way, if you're new here today, make sure to like, give me a thumbs up, make sure to subscribe and click the bell so that you're notified when I jump on. For the foreseeable future, you could expect me to be on at 8 p.m. on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday. But still go ahead and subscribe, click the bell button, make sure you get notified when I'm on. Defining racism safely, the prejudice problematic. Another systemic tool that affords ignorance of racism concerns what scholar Margaret Wetherell has referred to as the prejudice problematic, a way of understanding racism that locates the foundations of the problem in the stereotypical beliefs, prejudicial evaluations, and learned associations of individual minds. Right? Early theorists of prejudice, most notably Gordon Allport, focus on racial dynamics in terms of individual expressions of antipathy and hostility towards a group or its members. Let me just pause here for a second and say this. You know, when we talk about the African-centered curriculum, we also got to think about the European or the Eurocentric curriculum in that. Think about what happened, you know, at the beginning of this paper, they talked about the Trayvon Martin case. And think about what happened when a bunch of white women and stuff was on that, you know, was on that jury for Zimmerman. If you remember in an interview shortly after the verdict, there was a white woman calling George Zimmerman Georgie. Well, I think Georgie was a nice person. Now, where does a lot of that come from? Well, a lot of their decision making comes from the education they received. This is why it's so important that we have our own education too. As a matter of fact, when we get our own education percolating, right, I believe you'll see less of the nonsense going on within our society. You learn from a savage, you become a savage. There's a female rapper who recently had a song celebrating being a savage. If you learn from the savage, you act like a savage. And so when you see black folks killing one another and all this old shit out here, it comes from who we have been, you know, taught by. Though some researchers began to consider broader group-level explanations for racial prejudice in the mid-60s and early 70s, because conceptions of individual prejudice failed to account for the institutionalized nature of racism that was the focus of the civil rights movement in the U.S., the root cause was still largely considered the problem of biased individuals who discriminate. And that's something that we have bought into. A lot of us have bought into, well, it's certain individuals. I'm not saying that it's a whole goddamn army. We're looking at one or two soldiers not recognizing that they are part of an army. Notably, even today, this individual level understanding of racism is more prominent among white Americans and people of color. And despite efforts to shift academic discourse towards discussions of systemic racism, prejudice models continue to inform contemporary conceptions of racism in mainstream institutions such as law, politics, and hegemonic social science. Whenever you see people of color, just move past that, because the reality is, and if my display capture was working, I would have shown it to you. But you got people who look like us, who are considered people of color, who have either absolute contempt on one hand towards us, or indifference on the other hand. And to me, they're almost the goddamn, well, they have the same result. There's an Ethiopian guy, from what I understand, he's like an ambassador to the African Union today. Like in the 1960s, in an old bit of footage, right, you see him talking about, you know, he's Ethiopian, but he's not black, right? He's not black. And the problems that blacks outside of Ethiopia, even on the continent, endure, are not their problems. That's his words, right? I'm sure not all Ethiopians would say the same, but that's what this asshole is saying. They're not the same. Even, and he says it. He said, even though my face might be brown, I'm different. The problems of those people, you know, are not our problems. I am brown because Ethiopia is 800 feet above sea level. So because I'm closer to the sun, I am brown. But that has nothing to do for me when it comes to, you know, these other black people. And that's a shame. That's a quote unquote person of color. And listen to the bullshit. He's finding the white women around him, try to play it surprise, and like, oh my, no, you know, you can't really mean that. But they're happy to hear it. People of color. One problem with the prejudice problematic. Did I finish the thought? Yeah. One problem with the prejudice problematic is its location within the broader neoliberal individualist way of being and associated forms of knowledge that inform standard accounts in hegemonic social science. Perspectives of decolonial theory emphasize the extent to which these forms of knowledge are not an objectively neutral or politically innocent understanding of social reality, but instead reflect the racial power of colonial violence. From this perspective, the very possibility of modern individualist subjectivity positionality rests upon the colonial violence that provided a privileged few at the expense of the vast majority with sufficient affluence to enable the sense of freedom from constraint and independence from contexts associated with modern individualism. However, the reference to coloniality is not only a comment on the origins of modern individualism and racial violence, but also refers to the consequence of associated knowledge forms for the ongoing reproduction of racial violence. That brings us to a section called Implications for Anti-Racism Efforts. To illustrate how individualist constructions of person and the prejudice problematic in particular afford reproduction of violence, consider implications for the focus of anti-racism efforts. Simply put, a conception of racism as individual prejudice suggests a focus of anti-racism efforts on reduction of this prejudice. One problem with this conception of anti-racism efforts is that transforms the historically particular problem of white supremacist violence and European global domination into a more general issue of equipotential intergroup intolerance. In other words, it regards anti-white prejudice among people of African descent to be just as problematic as anti-black prejudice among people of European descent. The result of this conception of racism is equipotential prejudice. As equipotential prejudice, any endorsement of intergroup bias, regardless of power differentials and historical context, is an all lives matter approach to anti-racism action that focuses on equal treatment regardless of race, while conveniently forgetting the downstream effects of differential treatment set in motion by centuries-old colonial violence that continue to reproduce the unjust status quo. So this is something I would want black folks to really pay attention to. Again, I'm not at all do I care to convince white folks of anything. In my opinion, they already know this shit. It's us who need to fully understand the tactics and then counter. This suggests a second problem with the conception of anti-racism efforts as prejudice reduction. It transforms problems of structural injustice into problems of tolerance and interpersonal emotion. In response to people who express indignation about enduring structural racism, this expression of anti-racism incorporated asks, can't we all just get along? In response to the masses who express a deep hunger for social justice, this expression of anti-racism incorporated replies, let them eat harmony. That is, let the suffering masses be content with knowledge that most people bear them no ill feeling or racial animus. This construction of anti-racist action delegitimizes and attenuates indignation about historical and ongoing injustice, leads people to trade justice for peace and harmony, and contributes to the reproduction of an unjust status quo by undermining motivation for resistance. And this is nothing but a word right here. This is how they rock you to sleep. Right? This is how they rock you to sleep. No justice, no peace. Right? Can't we all just get along? Right? And all that really does, all that marching in a circle shit, all that really does is get you to your 10,000 steps a day or whatever. But seriously, all it really does is it just keeps the status quo going. There's no resistance in that. There's no resistance in that. Implications for perception of racism. This is a section that we're coming to now. As another illustration of how conceptions of racism as individual bias afford reproduction of violence, consider implications for perceptions of racism and support for anti-racist policy or collective action. By locating the foundations of racism and individual bias, the prejudice problematic understates the extent to which racism causes harm. In particular, it limits the notion of racism to cases where one person engages in differential treatment toward another person, whether as a result of deliberate prejudice or less conscious bias. It does not admit the possibility of racism by disparate impact, whereby the similar treatment results in systematically different outcomes for racially advantaged and disadvantaged targets. So I'm going to pause here on that note and say that here's the thing, right? This is why we got to be careful with how we define and talk about racism, right? If you build a nation, let's say you build a nation for all of your blood relatives, right? You buy land, right? You acquire land and you put all your relatives on this land. You incorporate it or what have you, make it a city in your family name. I'm not your relative. If I come and I live amongst you, I find my way amongst you, right? If you have the chance to choose from one of your people or me, you're going to 9 times out of 10 choose one of your people. That's what you're supposed to do when you consider the impetus for why you even created this family nation to begin with, right? Obviously, for you to buy land and have all your family members, all your blood relatives together, you did it because you know that there's power in numbers. There's power in all of you being together. And because you're kin, right, you would expect each person to look out for the other. But I'm a stranger, right? I am a population, right? A population of one, albeit, within your nation. When you make your choices, you will choose your people. And we got to understand that. So on the job, when they choose a white guy who's not anywhere qualified as you for the job, understand they're doing what they're really supposed to do. What you have to do is counter that by creating your own institutions and hiring your own people. And that's really what's supposed to be going on here. Even as a population in a nation, if you talking about buy black and create black business, I want to see everyone inside black. More importantly, I want to see all your supply chain as black. And all of the members of each supply, I want to see all their people black. This is why when I talk about popular grifters, there's a popular grifter who, and you guys are going to know who I'm talking about, popular grifter who put together a music group. And in the music group is a bunch of white folks. You mean to tell me you couldn't find a black guy to play the guitar? You couldn't find a black guy to break dance? Or whatever some shit they're doing? Like, come on. That's how I know you're a fraud. You put out DVDs and the people doing the editing and filming is white folks? Come on. Could you imagine me or Oni or the Harsh Reality Podcast or any one of us? Could you imagine we show up to do a documentary and we have a gang of white folks behind us? So understand what white folks are doing. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. You're the outsider. They're going to choose their people first. You have to counter and do the same. Nor does it admit the possibility of racism embedded in the structure of American society. A person who draws upon this conception to make judgments about the extent of racism in American society or about the role of racism in the particular events is likely to focus on the beliefs and attitudes of the people involved. Given that a large proportion of people in U.S. society claim non-racist ideology, the person is likely to conclude that racism is not a plausible explanation for differential outcomes, and this conclusion is likely to undermine the person's support for forceful anti-racism measures. I do think the author has a point there. If you're still, if you still have this accommodationist, this integrationist mindset, if you're still working within that paradigm, what the author is saying is on point. But that's why I said at the beginning, if you don't understand what's going on, you'll be confused. Not to sound like, nearly fuller, but you will be confused. These people are at war with you. They're looking out for their own people. End of story. It follows from this reasoning that an important intervention to counteract epistemologies of ignorance is to promote conceptions of racism as a force embedded in the structure of American society. Evidence for this assertion comes from two experiments in which researchers exposed social psychology students to either a sociocultural tutorial that defined racism in structural terms or a more standard tutorial that defined racism as individual bias. Right there you could see the problem with the setup of this experiment. But again, under the paradigm of thinking about being an integrated society, this would be the proper way you would set up the experiment. For example, the prejudice problematic. Results of both experiments confirm that students not only, one, tended to perceive greater racism in everyday events, but also, two, showed greater endorsement of forceful anti-racist policy after exposure to the tutorial outlining a socio-cultural conception of racism, i.e., as a force embedded in the structure of modern society, than after exposure to a more standard tutorial rooted in the prejudice problematic. So this brings us to the conclusion. If you're in the chat room or if you're listening to the playback in the comment section, what are your thoughts of this paper so far up to the conclusion? Do you think I missed anything in my commentary? Or do you think the paper was lacking in any kind of more or less outrageous type of way? Hit me your comments. If you're live with me now in the comment section and you type a comment, I will read it on the air. So conclusion, how to reproduce or produce decolonial consciousness. In this chapter, we presented two provisional strategies to decolonize consciousness. We apply these strategies to consider group differences in perception of racism. The first strategy is to provide a context-sensitive, normalizing account of oppressed group patterns that hegemonic accounts portray as abnormal. The second strategy is to turn the analytic lens and denaturalize white American tendencies of racism denial that mainstream accounts portray as unbiased reflection of objective reality. The foundation of these decolonizing strategies lies in a preferential consideration for epistemic perspectives of the oppressed as a privileged standpoint from which to understand everyday life in modern global order. This suggests that an important direction for anti-racism action is cultivation of opportunities for people to engage with marginalized epistemic perspectives. And I totally disagree. But again, in their paradigm, which is integrationist, that's what they would say. My solution is come to a quick understanding, right? Who is your enemy? What their tactics are, deception, right? And understand that early, and that they do it in all aspects of life. You go to the church, they doing it there. You go to work, they doing it there. And so forth and so on. You go to the judicial system, they really doing it there. Right? Like other hegemonic institutions in U.S. society, universities have evolved in accordance with the imperative to promote white comfort. This is perhaps especially true in the context of the neoliberal university, in which instructors face increasing pressure to offer the products that consumers, aka students, and that's a problem too. Students should not be viewed as consumers, but I'll talk about that at another date, right? AKA students demand. When those consumers are the model middle-class white students who disproportionately constitute many university settings, there are strong pressures to offer products that provide credentials for the market rather than critical thinking skills to prepare people for civic engagement. There are pressures to offer products that produce positive feeling and reinforce glorifying narratives of American exceptionalism. As a result of these pressures, universities are not neutral sites, but rather racialized corporate entities actively engaging in elevating certain epistemic standpoints over others. I wish they wouldn't say certain and just get right to the point. To decolonize consciousness, we must decolonize knowledge institutions by infusing them with epistemic perspectives of racially subordinated groups. If I drank every time they said epistemic perspectives, I'd be drunk. Within the U.S., a key site of this struggle is the conflict over ethnic studies courses. Outside the U.S., key sites of this struggle include the Rhodes Must Fall, #RhodesMustFall movement, or demands by South African students to decolonize the university. Advocates for such interventions rightly note the importance as an antidote for internalized oppression, autocolonialism, or colonial mentality among people from racially subordinate groups. Here we emphasize the importance as an antidote to epistemologies of white ignorance that promote denial of racism and opposition to anti-racist policy. The fierce resistance to these epistemic interventions serves as a reminder that white racial power has a strong interest in the production of sanitized knowledge and suppression of potentially transformative knowledge. As the case of Black History Month and other contributions to this book suggest, this resistance and suppression sometimes come in the form of incorporation rather than explicit resistance. And we really need more explicit resistance. So that brings me to the end of the paper. I thought it was a pretty good paper. What were your thoughts? Those of you in the chat room who were live with me, and for those of you who come across the episode later on a playback on YouTube or what have you, what were your thoughts of this paper today? While I wait to see if anyone says anything in the chat room, quick reminder, support everything that you see KWAZ Radio. Come and help out with the, lend your ideas, lend your hands, lend your thoughts, etc. For the African-centered curriculum. I have some good resources up on the Discord site. Come through, take a read, and help us really flesh this out. In addition, I'm still looking for someone, unfortunately, on a kind of a volunteer basis, so you have to be like a fan of the show. Still looking for someone who can help produce the show, particularly doing outreach to people for interviews and stuff like that. I really want to get back to being able to interview folks, but it takes a lot of time to do it, and sometimes I don't have all the time to reach out and follow up with people, so I would like to have someone who can do that. And again, lastly, check out what Onita has to say in the organization that he's building right now on his Discord server as well. All right, so it seems like I don't have any additional comments, but I want to thank everyone who sat here with me or stood here with me as I went through this reading. I want to thank the new person, I Am Sudan, for stopping in, dropping some comments, KW Don 7, Renee, Pro Black Perspective. Thanks to all you guys. Like I said, if you are new here, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel, hit the bell. Until next time, this has been the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Peace, y'all.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.